All right. Hi, everybody. Our guest today is Emily Willingham, who wrote this book, which is called Phallacy, which might have the greatest cover of any book ever in history, if you ask me, at least. Don't you think?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to ask a whole bunch of questions called Phallacy Lessons from the Animal Penis. So basically, this conversation is going to be all about penises, I guess. So we'll see how it goes. First, let me tell you why this book's important to me. I mean, I found this book really fascinating. Actually, before I even get into why, you got to explain the origins of the word fascinating, because I didn't even know this till I read your stuff.
I didn't know that either until I wrote it. So there's an ornamentation like that the people wore in ancient Rome that were called fascinums. We looked this up actually while we were doing the audio recording for the book and decided that had to be the correct pronunciation. And those are amulets, a lot of them, that depict a phallus with wings. They're winged phalli, and they were intended to be protective for children against, sort of evil things like the evil eye type protection. And that is the origin of things that are fascinating, because you want to distract it by being fascinating, I guess, to the evil eye so that it doesn't turn on your children.
So every time anyone who's watching this says the word fascinating, you should think about a winged phallus.
The winged phallus, yes.
That's what
Yep.
you're actually
Protect.
describing.
Yep.
Yeah, great, great. Anyway, let me talk about why it's so fascinating to me is because one of the things you do so well, and my background is in Jungian psychology, which in Father Figure I talk a lot about how problematic it is. But what you do so well is just sort of dislodge this sort of gendered imagination we have about how genitals start to shape our ways of thinking, the essential things about things, because you show in this book how all that stuff we've heard about penis being penetrating and the vagina being this great canal vessel is just while it might be true in human anatomy, it's certainly not true across the whole animal kingdom. Is that right?
Yeah, I would actually even take exception for human anatomy as well. But yeah, surely. So the subtitle of the book is Life Lessons from the Animal Penis. And the reason is that one of those lessons is that while we have spent a great deal of time focusing on penises and much less so on vaginas, I did make this central chapter of the book about the vagina. And that was really purposeful on my part to center it that way. And the main point of that chapter is that if you see a lot of adornment on penises, which you don't really see on ours so much, things like spikes, and they look like maces and they have hooks and things like that, you can anticipate finding similar adjustments and adaptations if you bother to look at the vagina or whatever the penis gets inserted into, and to the partner and to the mating partner. And we have not actually bothered with that nearly as much as we should have. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's what. It's also really interesting when you think about. I mean, what your book really. I was thinking about you. You bring up all these examples of all these animal penises that are spiked or they have bones in them or they or and there's one point where you just made me go, wait, it's so weird that we have all this sort of violent imagery around human sex when actually like we're not even really that it's actually one of the most like least violent in the animal kingdom. Is that fair to say?
It is fair. Well, I don't think of any of this as violence. I think aggression probably is maybe a better way to put it. Like when people think about the duck penises that emerge ballistically and they're corkscrews, and they have this what looks like forced copulation between the partners. I mean, we interpret that as violence, right? Because we're humans and we are not ducks, and that looks violent to us. But I think it's more aggression than anything. And I would draw a distinction between those two things kind of qualitatively, which sounds horribly academic of me, but that's just how I think actually. And when it comes to ours, I think the phrase I use in the book is something to the effect of it couldn't really, pierce a ripe avocado necessarily. Whereas you've got, like, let's take bed bugs, for example, they have what's called a hypodermic needle like penis, and they stab a partner with it just in the thorax somewhere, basically, which We do interpret that as looking violent because for us, stabbing something is violent. But if you're a bed bug, that's reproduction. It's a reproductive act for them. So it does look uncomfortable from a human gaze, as the sociologists call it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if I can just pull out for a second, pull out. Oh, there's going to be so many of
Yeah,
these
it's
alarm
hard
sounds.
to
It just
hard to avoid.
hard to avoid. So it is what you are doing in this particular work is disassembling all of the meaning that we as humans have derived from the penetration of the sexual act to then extrapolate. This is kind of a leading question. I kind of know the answer, I kind of don't, but I want to hear in your words from a 30,000 foot view. Are you in essence dismantling all of this metaphor that we've kind of accepted as truth in our society?
I am attempting to dismantle quite a few metaphors and to sort of peel away the kind of human layers that we've laid on to what we witness, what we see in these animals, and the things that we ignore in these animals as well, and the assumptions that we make about them because we have inherently a human perspective. We can't avoid that. But I do think it helps to put yourself in the position of the animal instead and to strip away, yes, exactly, these metaphors of violence or contentiousness between sexes. There was one, this is not actually that funny, but it still kind of makes me laugh a little bit. It was just so nutty. When my proposal was going around, one of the some publishing house that reviewed it sort of came back to me with a comment that it wasn't rapey enough because I didn't mention the word rape when I was talking about forced copulation. And I think that's a great example. Animals, that's not a thing, right? For non-human animals, that's a very human construct. It's a legal construct. It's a personal space construct. It's a violence construct, but it's not a thing that animals, non-human animals, employ, right? In any of those senses. And I was just sort of like, sorry that I didn't use the word rape about ducks. I mean, it just, and I think it's important for us to try to strip those things away and take these perspectives in part because people try to make these biological essentialism arguments about what constructs a man versus a woman, for example, and try to make them into a versus instead of a man and a woman or a woman and anybody else. So
Since you just brought that up, I was going to ask you about it later, but now I mean, not the rape part, but the last part of what you just said, so I'll just ask you about it now, which is you do such a great job, and I really want to get this expressed. I keep trying to express it to people. I think you're going to do it better than I do, which is that there really is no comprehensive, at least, sex binary, anatomy binary of male female. Can you break that down? Because this is the thing everybody doubts. Like they go, oh, but in the end, isn't there a man and women?
right. I mean, we're a very human thing is that we want to just sort of make things tidy, like especially if we can put it into two buckets, that's great, right? And just kind of ignore everything else. And so we approach so many things from that perspective. It's like, how can we categorize this? And if we could just put it in just two, that would be excellent. I mean, but you make this point in your book that, if you take intersex alone among humans, right? You're talking about 1% to 2% of people who fall somewhere along a spectrum there, and that's not an insignificant number of people. It's not a percentage or proportion that you could just go, well, shrug, that's just like 12 people in human history, who cares, which still would actually not be a great thing for you to do. Instead, it's a significant number of people, right? In absolute numbers. If you turn around away from humans and you look at non-human animals, you find lots of species that don't, where the structure we think of as a penis is not on the animal that makes the sperm. It's on the animal that makes the eggs. And that animal inserts that structure into the animal that makes the sperm and sucks the sperm up so that it can make contact with the eggs. So there's no there and it completely, this idea that there are just two sexes completely erases hermaphrodites across the animal kingdom, of which there are so many. And then it erases a lot of species that will shift from making sperm to making eggs or vice versa. I mean, they're not two buckets here. There's not really buckets. It's a continuum. There are categories, certainly, but always exceptions to every single one of them.
Oh, I thought you had a question. Well,
Now shut it down.
We've already said a lot, but I want to step right back out then and ask you, how do you define, how do we define penis? And why is there a penis? Like, what is it?
So I had it's funny. It's an interesting question. It can be answered in a lot of ways. I do have a chapter that sort of addresses, what makes a penis. In mammals, there's a shared ancestry to it, and so we do have a shared sort of like components of it that construct one. But if you step into arthropods, or they'll make the things out of anything apparently, and just use, they use feet, they use the hypodermic insertion, but it doesn't go into a vagina. It just goes into the thorax. There's sperm delivery by way of the mouth, of the head, just anyway, jobbing around on the body somewhere. So, and the penises are made out of all kinds of things. And there will be people who will quibble with the use of the word penis even and say, oh, well, that's not one. And, where do you draw the line for what qualifies as one? In the book, I describe myself as having taught, especially just sort of, introductory biology, and describing the penis as a sperm delivery system. But it's a lot more than that. And they do play much bigger roles than that. And as we know from our personal experience as a species, we don't use penises only for reproduction. Obviously, we use them, for example, for fun. And we don't put them in places that are only there for reproductive purposes. And we're not the only species that's like that. There are lots of species that employ what we would call a penis for all kinds of reasons, just kind of hanging out, like goosing a friend, just like poking at something, using a couple of species just to kind of fight. So it does have a lot more purposes than just transferring sperm.
And you also explain that I mean, this is both connected to what the purpose of the penis is, and the imaginary binary, that there's a lot of species that have same-sex copulation.
Right. There are species that, there are plenty. They have, what is it? There's a very specific term for this. It is single sex partnering or single sex mating or something like that. And there are lots of species that do that. There are a few hypotheses about why species engage in that. And one of them is just like, they're just taking all comers because they've only got so long to live. And, you get your payoff is going to be better if you just take anything that shows up and, try to mate with it. There are other kind of speculative explanations for it, but yeah, it's all over the place. Yeah.
So I just want to go back a few minutes to the point at which Jordan and I were just frozen a few minutes ago was because I was going through the three arguments I have with people every day, which is at the very top that sex and gender are not correlative necessarily, and then that sex is non-binary, and I had a third one in my head. I don't know what it is right now, but I was thinking about what you were saying, and what was going through my head was, oh my God, is anyone? I mean. Or I can't imagine the pushback on what you've written, and I understand all of it because I've had the blessing of experiencing Jordan reading your book and being totally lit up and going, finally, there's just like more to prove what I know, et cetera, et cetera. But what has been your experiencing? What has been your experience? I know the arguments I get in every day. I mean, it's just you're really climbing an uphill battle here, aren't you?
It is in a sense that, but I also feel that I'm standing on firm ground with it because I do have a pretty good like global perspective on it and a good in-depth perspective. And I have what I feel like is an unassailable argument. I mean, biological essentialism is one thing. People, want to argue that sex and gender correlate and that there are only two sexes, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, I can, of course, defeat that handily and easily. There are so many examples in which you can do that. But there's also the idea that if you buy into that argument, you're alighting the one thing about us that makes us us, and that is our brains. It's not that we have super special brains, but they're ours. And that's what dictates our behavior. And that is what sort of gives us the contours of the gender we express. And if we ignore that, then we're ignoring what makes us essentially human. And we have the most unconstrained behavioral expression of any species. I think we should celebrate that and not try to confine it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in the celebrating it, but I think it's just really destabilizing, probably for a lot of
It
people
is.
who are. I know this when I was running my feminist platform for 10 years, where I was essentially making an argument that women are just as equipped as men to manage investments. And this was a really, really hard sell, both to men and women. I know,
Right.
it's like
Yeah.
shocking. But because it was so penetrating of our core ideas of who we are. What do you think people are so afraid of in losing that understanding of identity as gender?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did just write a book about brains, and one of the things that I write about is a distinction between people who have this sort of personality trait of openness versus not having being so high on openness. And the higher you are on openness, I think that this is pretty self-evident. The more likely you are to not find change so daunting and so scary.
Yeah.
Whereas if you score low on it, you will be less open to these quote unquote threats to identities that you think are permanent, that are enshrined, and that aren't the way nature actually has shaped a much broader variety than you may be aware of. So I think that it depends on how people come at you, doesn't it? Right. So if somebody comes at me and they say, for example, that somebody who's a trans woman is not actually a woman because they don't have the lived experience of growing up as a girl. I'm like, but they do. They grew up as a girl and they grew up unrecognized as one, which is a very specific kind of experience to have. And I think if people are in good faith about it and they really are interested and have enough openness to get into that, I would love to talk to them. But if they don't, I can't inject openness into people. It's not something you can do. And so the important thing that happens there is what I call elsewhere a nerd node, where you are the nerdy person in your circles. And people who are questioning that way, and they need somebody they can trust, not to just like shh at them, if they have a question. And that's a person who can take that moment to kind of pry open the door a little bit more and to expand that openness a little bit more. So I do try to do that if there's a good faith discussion going on about it.
And what and what you're and of course everything's a continuum, but I'm just dying to know, is it I is there a percentage study of like open humans versus not so open humans? What are we thinking here?
It is definitely a continuum. There are studies that show, for example, and this wouldn't be surprising, that people who identify as conservative politically tend to score lower on openness. I mean, it's openness, I think, is in a lot of senses the reverse of being conservative. If you're conservative, you want things to stay right the way they are. You want a status quo. I think it's important for all around, and I don't mean if somebody is being offensive to you or harming you. You don't need to like work on your empathy for that person. But in general, I think it's important all around to sort of do the perspective taking that our brains are capable of doing, and which is one of the things that distinguishes us as a species. Put yourself in the shoes of someone who is low on openness and who is fearful as a result of that. Fear makes us do a lot of things, and some of them aren't pretty. And so, if they don't cross a threshold into violence or something and they're just afraid, I think it's okay to try to be patient about that. But everybody's threshold varies. And so I would never advise somebody just be patient with everyone who's being an asshole to you and a bigot, of course not. But it's worth considering.
Yeah, well, I mean that connects to a point that was really in your book that was really um, eye opening to me. I mean, I don't know if it was eye opening, but well articulated in a way that I hadn't quite thought about it, which is the how often we use this idea of closedness or domination and use evolution as the argument for this, right? Like survival of the fittest. I have to
Mhm.
defend my position. I have to defend my argument, and that's like the natural order of things. And I think I quote you in the book about this, but then also connected to parenting, where I go, evolution really works just like parenting. Adaptability works much better than force. Is that
Right.
yeah?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I saw that argument and I think that's a good point that you made there. And the reason I wrote about that in the book is because I do think people misconstrue survival of the fittest all the time. I think that's been happening ever since the concept was introduced because they take fitness to mean strength, and that's not what fitness means. In a sense, it's sort of, you're a reasonably well fitted puzzle piece in the background of your environment, right? And if that works out, then you maybe have a bit of an adaptive edge over other other members of your species or whatever who don't have that. And so you may gain that little edge and reproduce and pass on whatever gene variants gave you that edge in the first place. And that's all that means is that you did that, right? But a lot of people like to construe survival of the fittest as this thing about winning and being the winner, and that everything is a competition, that you must win. And I do think that that comes into parenting all the time. I think that in parenting, a lot of parents fall into the trap of trying to win something between themselves and their children. And I think that's important to avoid. I don't think that that kind of tension helps anybody. And it means you're trying to establish an autocratic, kind of domineering stance over these human beings you brought into the world who I think deserve more than that from a parent,
Well, I
right?
think you'll appreciate. So Jordan and I are second go round
Mhm.
partners, and so we have two biological children from previous marriages. And I
Mhm.
was raised very athletic and take sports very seriously. And what I love about Jordan's parenting is he always taught his kids to dismantle the rules of all sports and make up their own.
Yeah, I think that's actually a fun thing to have done, and it's a good lesson to give to children. But the winning impulse, that whole focus on, oh, evolution's all about winning, like evolutionary psychology, there's a corner of it certainly where it's like dominate and win and woo, you're upright like a lobster with its shoulders squared or whatever, all that kind of crap. And
You would have so much fun at dinner in our house. I would never get over it.
I did you
I hear these things that come out of only Jordan's mouth, and I hear them coming out of yours. I'm going, yes, he has a friend.
This is funny. Did you know that a certain person who wrote 12 Rules for Life has a book that has another 12 rules? It's like, oh,
Yeah,
wait, there's more. Okay. Sorry, that
we'll
was a
have
little
we'll
side
have to
note.
send you the video that I made using your lobster trap argument. But
Oh,
I talked to a lobster about it right before
oh,
I
you
cook it.
did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I had a long talk with a lobster, right, and then before I reminded the lobster that I actually am dominant, even though it has no shoulders.
It has no shoulders. I know. Did it squirt pee at you? Is the question, the burning question. Yeah, I think we're a pro-social species. There's just a paper that just came out that I'm supposed to be writing about right now, actually, about maybe one of the reasons it gave Homo sapiens an edge over Neanderthals, for example, is because we are so pro-social. We will help each other. There's evidence in the archaeological record that we interacted with all kinds of other populations of Homo sapiens within bigger groups, that we supported older members of our societies and disabled members of our societies and things like that. And so this idea that that evolution shaped us as an adaptation just to constantly be trying to win things all the time is not a very apt or scientifically based concept.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, since we're on it, I mean, I would love to get into this. I mean, I don't want to mention that author because I'm like I don't want to get notoriety is its own kind of promotion that I don't want to give.
No.
But I do want to get into the what you call the lobster trap in in the book, which is this idea that we really can't use a single species to offer us a pattern to justify whatever. I don't know. You're going to explain it better than I do, so I'll let you do it.
I think people who have certain proclivities or propensities really like to find examples somewhere in the non human animal kingdom of something that kind of seems to justify those behaviors. So they then can appeal to biological essentialism. They can say, but evolution shaped me to be a jerk. And so therefore I'm a jerk because look at this animal over here being one. And that's a little simplistic, but I mean, it happens all the time and that I'll use the term we loosely, will take some example out there and go, ha, look, that means we're made to do that too. And I think they especially feel justified if they find examples in some of our closest relatives, if they find them in chimpanzees or bonobos or something, and they're like, look over there, that's happening. So I'm completely justified in doing this awful thing I'm doing or thinking this awful way I'm thinking. So
And I guess the larger point that you make in Phallacy is that if you really take a survey of the whole animal kingdom, there's no correlation between penis and masculinity at
oh
all.
no, yeah, not at
True.
all. Yeah, the pattern that you really see, if you look at penises in the animal kingdom, the pattern that you see is that the less crap they have on them, the less they have in the way of spikes and hooks and spatulas and all kinds of other things, the more the mating pair in that species tends to have a list of boxes that it checks off before they make intimate contact. And our penis falls very on the side of the spectrum of not having much of anything going on. We don't even have a bone inside of our penis, right? So that's on the end of we have boxes to check. And so people who try to appeal to, evolution as an excuse for sort of forced rape, forced copulation, except that we would call it rape, or to say that rape is kind of our default nature that we have to fight against, are full of shit. And that pattern is one reason that they are full of shit, because you see the animals that have forced copulation, their penises have all kinds of wacky stuff on them. And if you bother to look at the vaginas, you find adaptations that seem to be counterpoints to what you see on those penises. We don't have either of those things.
So then how have humans gotten this just so wrong for thousands of years? Like, where did we go off course?
I think actually, I don't know that we have gone off course. I think we magnify the people who do, of course, because they're so awful and so wrong. And it is very human to sort of magnify the negative to the exclusion of an overwhelming positive out there, right? If somebody says something bad about you amidst 100 positive comments, the thing that you'll remember the most is the bad one. You know how that goes. And the same thing goes for human behaviors that are horrific. And so I do think that we tend to magnify those. I really actually think the general pattern is that we have all kinds of rules about you check boxes, you don't do this to somebody else. I mean, that's pretty pervasive, rather than rape kind of being the standard, across society. So I don't think that it is, which is another reason the argument is nonsensical. These people are making this appeal based on some sort of personal sort of desideratum and not reality.
Yeah. Well, I want to. Well, not. I'm not really going to change topic, but I'm going to move away from your book to an article that you wrote in Scientific American that I found I loved the whole argument, the framing. So I'm going to ask you to talk about it, where you compare the resistance to wearing face masks during COVID to the resistance to wearing condoms during sex.
Yeah, so a lot of that resistance is driven by what I refer to as impossible masculinity. It's that kind of trifecta of what people perceive as supreme masculinity, where you're independent and you're defiant and the measure of strength is how much you don't bow down to rules. Um, and it's impossible because no human being is going to
Speaking of
meet all.
teenagers.
Speaking, oh, yeah, right. I have 3 of those in my house, so I know what you mean. It's impossible because no human being is going to meet all those marks, and it also is positioned as being the archetype of masculinity, and that's not how our brains are. Our brains aren't like that. We don't all conform in lockstep to this side of a bucket or being in this bucket, being in this bucket or anything like that. Obviously, we're a mix of many things. And the face mask thing is a lot like, well, public health people have written about this refusal to use condoms because it sort of ruins your masculine expression. You don't ejaculate into somebody, right, and possibly seed them with your sperm. It gets in the way of your pleasure, apparently, and a lot of other excuses that they make, and they all trace to this. I need to be extremely masculine in this sense that everybody's told me is masculine, with this phallus that can ejaculate, and I don't want anything in my way. And the masks kind of got centered that way as well. You see who's refusing them and why they're doing it. And it's a very similar kind of thing. You will not tell me to cover my face. I'm man enough to go out there and face down this fucking virus. Excuse me. Am I allowed to swear?
Yeah, you're allowed to.
Face down this virus, without having to put this little piece of paper on my face. And everybody's going to think that, I am not masculine enough or strong enough because I have this on my face. It's a terrible social message, and it's happened before. So, yeah.
So, I mean, you're so dialed into just a really zeitgeisty conversation that's playing out in some fascinating ways that I didn't even. I mean, even Me Too was a pleasant shock that happened. Um, what do you think? I mean, where do you think 10 years from now? What do you think has a possibility of really making waves? What's your hope for your work and Jordan's work, and where we might land, or what's the risk? Where's this all going?
So I'm contemplating teenagers, actually, since you just mentioned them, but I have been thinking about them a lot lately. I've taught for 20 something. I don't want to say how old I am now, but it's almost 30 years. It's been a long time. And I love teenagers. I love adolescents because they're in this phase where they are learning their rules, and maybe they don't like some of those rules and they don't make sense to them because of, context has changed and these other things. And they start to just change things. They start to recreate and create anew cultures for themselves. And they are doing that now. And it has been extremely deeply pleasing for me to see the things that they will not put up with coming in, as young people today, and the expectations they have and the discussions they voluntarily have about things like consent and stuff like that. We'll watch some horrible old John Hughes movie with my sons and they'll be like, whoa, that was not okay. And I'm like, thank you. Yes, it's not. And so I see the cultures that younger generations create as always the progressive culture, right? I don't think that people my age impose progress. I think it comes from that age group where they've got the space and the creativity and the learning space, the cognitive space right there, still that we kind of run out of later is all there. And so that's part of it. The other part of it, there are two pieces to it. One of them is language. I think that if we can be more intentional about our language and more careful about how we use it. Another thing I wrote for Scientific American is about big dick energy, that phrase that people use, or small dick energy that people use. Like, a guy wanders into a Starbucks with an automatic weapon hanging off his shoulder, and people are like, ooh, small dick energy. And I'm like, you probably think you're a progressive, but you're using a phrase like this and replacing this entire human being manifesting these ridiculous behaviors out of his fear, probably a lack of openness, wanting to meet some standard of impossible masculinity, and you're just reducing it to a body part. That's actually not okay. I think we should be more intentional about how we speak about these things in our language. And then the other thing is emotion recognition. I think one thing that we have historically taught boys and men in our culture is they need to hide them, stuff them down somewhere, don't face them, don't pay attention to them. But the thing is if you do that, you never learn how to manage them. You don't learn how to express them appropriately, contextually, et cetera. And so you get explosive instead. And I think that if we can start to work on emotion recognition all around, that would be a huge benefit.
Yeah.
What about speaking of language, what about this masculine energy versus feminine energy, which is really, really popular in progressive circles?
Yeah, I don't even know what that means, honestly. I have no idea what that even is. I don't really work with energy type stuff, but I mean, I think that it's funny because it kind of varies from culture to culture too, like how these things get defined, right? What's masculine and what's feminine. I think that things that women aren't and girls aren't allowed to express, or that we're told maybe isn't appropriate, are things that we label as masculine. And so I'm just spitballing here, if we present as a girl or woman and then we have these behaviors, then we also have a masculine energy. It's nonsense. I mean, we just have behaviors, I don't know why they have to have a valence, like that. But, we like our binaries. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think I only have one more question for you, which is I wonder if you could, while I was researching father figure and as I've started to talk about it, there's a really weird I think it's a myth, but I guess I'll ask you. You're the expert here. That there's something like essential in biological about fatherhood that like led to civilization and agriculture and something about men not being able, the separation that since they don't carry the baby, there's that they because they're fathers they had to build. You've heard all these, I'm sure too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because there are so many assumptions that go into that. There are assumptions that the cultures that preceded us sort of define gender in exactly the same way we do today, which is not at all the case apparently, and that they had division of labor that is sort of like women, undulate around and gather plants while children crawl all over them and men wander off together and with big weapons and kill giant animals. And evidently that's not really necessarily the case too. They've uncovered a number of sites where they find everybody's on it. It's not something that's along gender lines. So it's all problematic. And there are associations of, I think I write about this in the last chapter of the book, associations between agriculture where we started to kind of settle into a place and we started to try to grow things ourselves. And there are associations between that and the phallus as something protective. And I think I write about the Egyptian god Min as one of the earliest of the gods there in Egyptian mythology. And he is depicted with a phallus that's parallel to the ground. He also holds a flail, which he used, to harvest wheat. And then his plant, his like god plant, or whatever they call it anyway, is a lettuce, which is not a head of lettuce, but a lettuce more like romaine that is sort of phallus shaped. And if you cut it open, it oozes white fluid. And so, I mean, we can certainly tell a just so story about that and infer that all of these things go together. And there are more examples. Priapus is, started out as a scarecrow before he became better known for his gigantic erection. Definitely some associations there. I could speculate, and I think, there's some truth to it that, people who make more testosterone have more muscle mass and less fat, and that does make them more physically strong, right? They have more physical power, and that probably mattered earlier, when that was a thing. But, it's not so much a thing now, right? So,
Yeah. Um, you just made me think about it because another thing in your book that me as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about symbolism and how and what we can infer or guess or understand just from looking at ancient imagery. And one thing I had never seen that you talk about a lot is is all the medieval imagery of trees where women are harvesting penises from a tree. And
I
I'm like,
know.
wait, that's a whole other narrative than how we think about male promiscuity.
It was amazing. I mean, they nurture them in little nests and feed them like baby birds and stuff. And that one, the penis tree in Italy, it has like, I remember how many pieces, like 30 something penises in that tree, and the 8 women below. It's like they're harvesting apples basically, except they're penises, right? And they're kind of maybe fighting over them and stuff. That was amazing. I
Yeah.
really love that. And you can almost tell it was kind of in a period where people didn't have this kind of weird reaction to genitalia that, it's just like, oh, look, my child is wearing an amulet with a flying phallus on it. And here's a penis tree. And everybody was like, great, it's in the town square. Yay. And then it kind of became not a good thing, probably with the, advent of the church and so on. So, yeah.
Well, you have any questions for us?
Um, I was actually going to ask you about the 3 feathers. So I mentioned I have a bachelor's degree in English. And one of the things I did is I took a lot of folklore classes because I was just tooling around that way. And I'm wondering what you think about the sort of more probably better known story of, Lear, the one that got co-opted to become Lear and his 3 daughters. And I mean, you don't have to answer this at all, but I'm just kind of curious about how that fits into this idea of the choice among your children and who is worthy and that kind of thing. Also, I want to tell you that I think it's Aztecs have a toad and it's a uterus. It's a womb. I just wanted to let you know that about the toad.
Wait. Say that again. The Aztecs have
It's a womb, and there's this whole, I think it's Aztecs. I think so. Where there's an entry point that is into, it's a stone thing, right? And you
yeah.
walk into it and it's a toad and it has this thing you walk into and it's a womb, like you're walking into a womb. And so that may be something that's kind of cross-cultural, this perspective of like the toad is a womb or something.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly there are Jungians who make a really good argument for the toad or the frog being connected to uterine symbolism. And I don't necessarily disagree with it. You're talking about a part in the book where I take apart that myth. What I really disagree with is that sort of, as Amanda was just talking about, that all those stories are about the like integration of masculine and feminine energies, when historically, even if the toad is a uterine symbol, it was about the prince owning the toad. Right? It was not about the prince having some kind of loving, compassionate union with the princess.
Right. Owning the toad and everything the toad could bring with it, right? Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else?
No. I just was like, oh, yay.
Well, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. There's so many ideas here. I really hope people will get this book.
Me too.
Hold it up again. Right? Oh, I gotta get. There you go. Because it really is paradigm shifting. I think, even though it kind of shouldn't be, because it's not like the science wasn't already there, but it doesn't match with our popular imagination about these things, and so I think you do such a great job of deconstructing that in a really accessible, fun way. I mean, I am not a biology guy, and I still I still loved reading this book. It was just a fun read. I mean, and like this conversation, like it's like full of penis jokes in a way, which is so. In fact, I encourage men to read it. If you just want to read penis jokes while also changing your mindset, this is the book for you.
They're unavoidable. It's just terrible. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And also, Amanda, it's nice to meet you as well.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot.